Snow fell so heavily that the lonely railway station seemed to vanish beneath a white silence, while the wind swept across the empty platform with a mournful cry that sounded almost human. Curled upon an old wooden bench, a young woman lay trembling beneath a threadbare blanket, shielding 3 tiny newborns against her chest. Snow gathered upon her hair, her sleeves, and the worn fabric covering their fragile bodies, yet she did not move. Every fading breath she possessed belonged to the babies hidden beneath her. Anyone arriving before dawn would have believed they had discovered 4 frozen souls abandoned by the world, but the truth had begun many months before that terrible winter night. At 24 years old, Eleanor Whitford had once believed goodness could withstand any storm. She was the only daughter of Dr. Samuel Whitford, the most respected physician for miles around, a man who treated wealthy merchants and penniless laborers with equal compassion. Their modest home stood beside the village clinic, where laughter, gratitude, and healing filled every room. Eleanor spent her childhood grinding herbs, carrying water, and comforting frightened children while her father stitched wounds or soothed fevers. He taught her that a person's worth could never be measured by fortune, only by kindness offered when kindness cost something. Perhaps that lesson explained why she loved Thomas Hale. Thomas was a humble village schoolteacher whose coat always carried chalk dust upon its sleeves and whose smile somehow convinced frightened pupils that learning could become adventure. He possessed no inheritance, no grand estate, and no influential relatives. What he offered instead was unwavering honesty, patient gentleness, and quiet courage. Together they dreamed not of luxury but of ordinary happiness. A small home, shelves filled with books, children running through a vegetable garden, and evenings spent beside a warm fire while snow drifted beyond the windows. Their secret marriage took place inside the little chapel before sunrise, witnessed only by the elderly pastor who blessed them with tearful eyes. Their happiness, however, awakened the fury of Victor Blackwood, the wealthiest banker in the county. 4 years Victor had coveted Dr. Whitford's land because a new railway line would soon transform the surrounding fields into valuable property. When Eleanor refused his polished proposals, he hid his humiliation behind courteous smiles, then quietly began weaving revenge. Forged deeds appeared bearing counterfeit signatures. Judges accepted generous bribes. Officials suddenly discovered imaginary debts attached to the Whitford estate. Within weeks, legal notices stripped the family of everything they owned. Dr. Whitford fought desperately to expose the deception, but grief and exhaustion weakened his aging heart until illness claimed him before justice could arrive. Thomas refused surrender. Hidden among his schoolbooks rested the genuine land documents proving Victor's fraud. Knowing those papers could destroy the banker, Thomas secretly prepared to deliver them to provincial investigators. Before he could leave the village, hired thugs intercepted him along a snow-covered road. Eleanor never forgot the sight of her husband staggering home, blood staining his scarf after shielding her from their attack. He collapsed in her arms, whispering only that she must live for the child she carried. By dawn he was gone, leaving behind unbearable silence, an unborn baby, and enemies who still searched for the missing evidence. Pregnant, widowed, and homeless, Eleanor found every familiar door quietly closing before her. Neighbors pitied her, yet fear of Victor's influence proved stronger than sympathy. No family dared invite her inside. She sold her wedding ring, her mother's silver brooch, and nearly every possession remaining from happier days until she gathered enough coins for a single train ticket. Her destination was the distant town where Thomas's elderly aunt still lived, the last person who might welcome her without asking questions. The journey began beneath gray skies already heavy with snow. Eleanor settled into a crowded carriage, clutching one worn suitcase and the blanket she had stitched months earlier for the baby she expected. She prayed only for safe arrival. Instead, sharp pain seized her before noon. Another followed. Within minutes, every hope of reaching her destination disappeared beneath the relentless rhythm of labor. Panic rippled through the passengers. Some complained bitterly about delays, while others shrank away in frightened uncertainty. Only one elderly retired nurse stepped forward without hesitation. She ordered blankets gathered, boiling water prepared, and curious strangers pushed aside. The train thundered through the frozen countryside as Eleanor struggled through hours that blurred into agony, courage, and desperate prayer. Just before midnight, the first baby cried. Moments later came another. Then, astonishing everyone inside the carriage, a third tiny cry joined the first 2. Triplets. The exhausted nurse smiled through tears, but relief quickly dissolved into uneasy murmurs. 3 hungry newborns filled the carriage with constant cries. The unexpected birth forced the train to remain stopped far longer than scheduled. When the conductor finally calculated the extra expense, He demanded additional payment Eleanor simply could not provide. She emptied her pocket, revealing only a few worthless coins. Angry voices rose around her. Some insisted the babies carried illness. Others declared she would doom everyone's journey. Fear spread faster than compassion. At the next isolated station, before dawn and beneath a blizzard, the conductor reluctantly obeyed the passengers' demands. Eleanor, still weak from childbirth, stepped onto the deserted platform carrying 3 swaddled infants and 1 fading hope. She wrapped them beneath her blanket, lay across their tiny bodies upon the freezing bench, closed her weary eyes against the wind and whispered, "If heaven must choose, spare my children." Moments later another train hissed into the station. A tall duke dressed in black stepped onto the snow-covered platform after burying his own infant son. He noticed one impossibly small hand emerging beneath the blanket, dropped to one knee and whispered, "No, not tonight. I'll save you all." The duke lifted Eleanor into his own carriage as though she weighed no more than the snow collecting upon his shoulders. One servant carefully gathered the 3 newborns, while another wrapped hot blankets around them before the bitter wind could steal another breath. No one questioned their master's orders. His voice, usually calm and restrained, carried an urgency none of them had heard since the death of his infant son only days earlier. The horses surged forward through the storm, racing toward Blackthorn Manor while the station disappeared behind curtains of swirling white. Inside the carriage, Eleanor drifted between consciousness and darkness. She felt warm hands pressing blankets around her and heard faint cries from her babies, yet every sound seemed distant as though she floated beneath frozen water. The Duke never removed his eyes from the tiny bundles resting beside her. Their fragile faces reminded him painfully of the son he had buried beneath cold winter earth that very afternoon. Grief tightened around his heart, but it no longer felt empty. It carried purpose again. When the carriage reached the estate, every lamp in the manor blazed to life. Doctors were summoned from neighboring villages despite the storm. Maids hurried through echoing hallways carrying steaming water, clean linens, and medicine. The estate physician worked tirelessly through the remainder of the night, warming tiny hands, treating frostbitten skin, and coaxing weak cries into healthy lungs. Dawn arrived pale and silent before he finally straightened his aching back and faced the Duke with exhausted relief. "They will live," he whispered. The Duke closed his eyes for only a moment, offering a silent prayer he had been unable to speak beside his own son's grave. Blackthorn Manor had once been known throughout the county for its grand celebrations, elegant music, and endless laughter. Those days had faded years earlier when the Duke's beloved wife died giving birth to their only child. Though the infant survived for several months, illness eventually claimed him as well, leaving every room haunted by absence. Dust gathered upon untouched pianos. The ballroom remained locked. Even the servants had learned to whisper instead of laugh, as though joy itself had become disrespectful beneath that roof. 3 tiny babies changed the silence almost immediately. Their cries echoed through corridors that had forgotten every childish sound. Nurses hurried from room to room with bottles of warm milk. Footsteps replaced stillness. Kitchen fires burned longer into the night preparing nourishing meals for Eleanor. The elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Ashcombe, who had not smiled in years, quietly knitted 3 wool caps before anyone thought to ask her. The head gardener carved little wooden rattles from leftover oak branches during his evenings. Even the stern butler polished an abandoned cradle until its carved sides gleamed once more. Several days later, Eleanor finally opened her eyes fully. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains onto an unfamiliar bedroom decorated in warm creams instead of cold stone. Her first panic thought was for her babies. She tried rising despite her weakness, only to find the Duke standing quietly beside the doorway. "They're safe," he said before she could speak. She burst into relieved tears. The Duke stepped aside, allowing 3 bassinets to be wheeled beside her bed. The babies slept peacefully beneath soft quilts stitched with tiny stars. Eleanor reached trembling fingers toward them, counting each gentle breath as though afraid one might vanish if she looked away. Only after touching every tiny hand did she finally believe they had survived. Days later, when her strength slowly returned, she asked to meet the Duke properly. She found him inside the library, where towering shelves of books surrounded a crackling fireplace that chased away the winter cold. "You owe me nothing," he told her gently. She lowered her gaze. "With respect, Your Grace, I cannot live on charity. You have nowhere else to go." "That may be true," she replied softly, "but my father taught me that gratitude should never replace honest work." For the first time in many months the Duke smiled. It was a small smile, almost forgotten, yet genuine. Then work honestly, he answered. Our seamstress retired before winter. The nursery also needs caring hands. Accept those duties, and this house shall earn your presence rather than merely offer it. Eleanor accepted with quiet dignity. Her mornings soon filled with mending children's clothes stored away after the Duke's terrible loss. Rather than hide them inside trunks again, she carefully altered each tiny garment for the growing triplets. During quiet afternoons she repaired curtains, embroidered blankets, and organized the neglected nursery until warmth gradually replaced sorrow. She never complained, never asked for favors, and thanked every servant who crossed her path regardless of rank. Her humility quietly transformed the household as surely as the baby's laughter filled its halls. The triplets flourished under constant care. The eldest possessed calm, watchful eyes. The second laughed before he could crawl. The youngest demanded attention with determined cries that somehow delighted everyone. Whenever servants finished their duties, they invented excuses to pass through the nursery simply to glimpse the babies smiling. Each evening, almost without fail, the Duke appeared carrying a different storybook rescued from forgotten shelves. He settled into the rocking chair beside the cradle and read aloud with surprising tenderness. Although the babies understood none of the words, they stared at his face with complete fascination. Before long, each child stretched tiny arms toward him whenever he entered. The youngest often refused sleep until resting against his broad shoulder, where the steady rhythm of his heartbeat calmed every restless tear. One snowy evening Eleanor carried folded blankets toward the nursery and paused outside the half-open door. Candlelight flickered softly across the room. The Duke knelt beside a broken wooden cradle, carefully sanding splintered edges before fitting a newly carved support beneath its frame. His elegant coat lay forgotten across a nearby chair, while wood shavings covered his sleeves. He worked patiently despite several small cuts across his hands. "You could have asked a carpenter," Eleanor whispered. He looked up with quiet embarrassment. "I thought the hammering tomorrow might wake them." She watched him tighten the final screw, then gently rock the cradle to test its balance. It moved perfectly. Something inside her heart, frozen since Thomas's death, shifted almost imperceptibly. Later that night, as snow drifted quietly beyond the nursery windows, Mrs. Ashcombe approached the Duke with unusual hesitation. "Your Grace," she murmured, "the village has begun talking. They say a mysterious young widow and 3 infants now live under your roof. They wonder why." The Duke glanced toward the nursery where Eleanor softly sang her babies to sleep, and though he answered nothing, the thoughtful shadow crossing his face hinted that the greatest storm threatening Blackthorn Manor had not arrived with the winter, but with the rumors now spreading beyond its gates. Winter settled over Blackthorn Manor with deceptive peace, yet beyond its iron gates whispers multiplied faster than falling snow. Merchants lowered their voices whenever the Duke's name arose. Ladies at afternoon teas exchanged curious glances behind delicate fans. Stable boys carried rumors between neighboring estates until fiction began sounding more believable than truth. Some insisted the mysterious widow had bewitched the grieving Duke. Others claimed the 3 babies were secretly his own. Compassion disappeared beneath gossip, proving once again that cruel tongues often traveled farther than honest hearts. Eleanor sensed the change before anyone spoke openly. Servants returning from the village hesitated before meeting her eyes. Delivery men lingered only long enough to unload supplies before hurrying away. Even letters arriving for the Duke carried an unusual stiffness, their wax seals belonging to noble families who had rarely written during the lonely years following his wife's death. She continued sewing, tending the nursery, and smiling for the triplets, yet unease quietly settled beside her like another shadow in the room. Far beyond the estate, Victor Blackwood received unexpected news from one of his paid informants. The widow he believed destined to perish in the blizzard had survived. Not only had she lived, but she had found shelter beneath the protection of the county's most respected Duke. Victor crushed the letter within his gloved hand until the paper tore. His greatest fear had never been Eleanor herself. It was the possibility that somewhere the genuine land deeds still existed, waiting to expose every forged signature, every bribed official, and every crime he had committed to steal the Whitford property. He immediately summoned 2 trusted associates to his office. "She must be discredited before anyone believes her," he said coldly. "If the Duke turns against her, she loses everything." "And if he keeps protecting her?" one man asked. Victor smiled without warmth. "Then we shall convince the county that his judgment has failed." Within days anonymous pamphlets appeared across nearby towns. They questioned the identity of the baby's father. They suggested Eleanor had manipulated a grieving nobleman to secure comfort and wealth. They hinted that respectable families should avoid Blackthorn Manor until its honor was restored. None of the accusations carried evidence, yet they spread eagerly because scandal required far less proof than kindness. Eleanor first encountered the lies inside the village bakery. She had gone alone to purchase fresh flour while the triplets slept under Mrs. Ashcombe's care. Conversation stopped as she entered. Two women turned away, pretending sudden fascination with the shelves. A child innocently asked his mother whether the lady with 3 babies truly lived inside the Duke's bedroom. The horrified mother hurried him outside without answering. Eleanor paid quietly, thanked the baker despite his obvious discomfort, and walked home through gently falling snow with tears she refused to shed until no one remained watching. The Duke found her later repairing tiny winter coats beside the nursery fire. "You've heard?" he said softly. She nodded. "I am sorry." He frowned. "You have done nothing requiring apology. They are speaking because of me. They are speaking because gossip is easier than truth." His calm voice comforted her, yet it could not silence the growing storm beyond the estate walls. Soon afterward an invitation arrived from the annual Winter Assembly, the largest gathering of influential families in the county. Attendance had long been expected of every prominent landowner. Mrs. Ashcombe quietly suggested declining. Eleanor secretly prayed he would. Instead, the Duke folded the invitation, placed it into his pocket, and announced that Blackthorn Manor would attend as always. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers reflecting hundreds of candles. Music floated gracefully between polished marble columns while nobles exchanged elegant greetings wrapped in practiced smiles. Conversations faltered the instant the Duke entered. Eleanor remained behind at the manor with the babies, unaware that her future reputation would be weighed inside that magnificent hall. Victor Blackwood waited patiently until nearly everyone had gathered. Raising his crystal glass, he praised the generosity of noble families before allowing calculated disappointment to enter his voice. "It saddens me," he declared, "that certain great houses now shelter women of questionable character while expecting respectable society to applaud such decisions." The silence arrived instantly. Every eye shifted toward the Duke. Victor continued smoothly. "A gentleman's compassion should never blind him to appearances. 3 fatherless infants beneath one roof create unfortunate questions." The Duke set down his untouched glass. He neither hurried nor raised his voice. Instead, he crossed the ballroom with measured steps until he stood directly before Victor. "I have buried my wife," he said quietly. "I have buried my son. I know what true suffering looks like." His blue eyes hardened. "The woman you insult lost her father, her husband, her home, and nearly her children before freezing upon a station bench. No one breathed. She asked me for work instead of charity. She earned every kindness shown beneath my roof." Then his voice carried across the entire ballroom. "Anyone who insults this mother insults my house." Crystal glasses stopped trembling only after several endless seconds. Victor attempted another smile, yet uncertainty flickered behind his confidence for the first time. The Duke turned away without requesting permission or offering further explanation. By dawn the entire county knew exactly where he stood. Unfortunately, Eleanor also learned. When the Duke returned, she greeted him with grateful composure, but fear quietly rooted itself inside her heart. She understood the terrible weight carried by a noble family's reputation. Every cruel rumor endangered not only the Duke's standing but also the loyalty of tenants, servants, and allies who depended upon his respected name. The thought that she might destroy the man who had rescued her became unbearable. That night she packed in silence. She folded the baby's tiny clothes, wrapped each child carefully against the cold, and left a handwritten letter upon the nursery table thanking the Duke for giving them life when the world had abandoned them. Before sunrise she slipped through the sleeping manor carrying one infant against her chest while the other 2 rested inside a small wagon lined with blankets. Snow muffled every sound except the wheels crunching across the frozen path leading toward the estate gates. She had almost reached the road when footsteps broke through the whitening darkness. The Duke emerged breathless from the falling snow, coat thrown hastily over nightclothes, his boots scarcely fastened. He had clearly searched every room before racing outside. The triplets recognized him instantly. All 3 began crying and stretching tiny hands toward the only fatherly figure they remembered. Eleanor lowered her head, unable to meet his eyes. He stopped before her, gently lifted the smallest baby into his arms, and whispered with heartbreaking certainty, "Home isn't a place anymore, it's wherever the 4 of you are." Eleanor's resolve shattered as tears streamed freely down her face, Yet neither of them noticed a distant rider watching from beyond the trees before galloping away toward Victor Blackwood with news that the Duke's devotion had become far stronger than anyone imagined. Morning arrived beneath a pale winter sky, but peace refused to return to Blackthorn Manor. Eleanor remained after the Duke stopped her at the estate gates, yet neither of them pretended the danger had passed. Victor Blackwood had failed to separate them with lies, and failure only sharpened his cruelty. Somewhere beyond the snow-covered hills, he was planning another move, one that would erase every remaining thread connecting Eleanor to the truth about her husband's death. Inside the manor, life continued with determined normality. The triplets grew stronger each week, filling the nursery with cheerful laughter that echoed through hallways once burdened by grief. Eleanor devoted herself to sewing, mending, and caring for the children, while the Duke quietly arranged trusted investigators to examine every suspicious transaction connected to Victor's banking empire. Nothing substantial emerged. Witnesses had vanished, records had disappeared, and frightened officials remembered nothing. It seemed the evidence had dissolved into winter mist. One afternoon an elderly messenger arrived carrying unexpected news. A shepherd repairing a collapsed fence near Eleanor's abandoned cottage had noticed strangers visiting the ruined property after dark. They searched the house with lanterns, pried open cupboards, and tore loose floorboards before leaving empty-handed. The old man feared thieves and thought someone should know. Eleanor immediately understood. Thomas had hidden the genuine land deeds somewhere inside that cottage before he died. If Victor's men had failed to find them, they might still be there. The Duke insisted they travel together the following morning with 2 trusted servants despite the bitter weather. Snow blanketed the lonely road leading toward the abandoned village. Every familiar landmark reopened old wounds inside Eleanor's heart. She passed the chapel where she and Thomas had exchanged secret vows, the schoolhouse where children once greeted him each morning, and finally the weathered cottage standing silent beneath layers of drifting snow. Broken shutters hung crookedly. Frost-covered shattered windows. It looked less like a home than a memory refusing to disappear. They searched carefully through each room. Dust covered overturned furniture. Cupboards stood empty. The nursery Thomas had painted for their expected child remained unfinished, tiny stars still visible upon one cracked wall. Eleanor knelt inside the bedroom where her husband had hidden important papers. She remembered him pausing beside the fireplace only days before his death, smiling mysteriously when she asked what troubled him. Suddenly her eyes settled upon an uneven wooden plank beneath the old bed. Her heartbeat quickened. Together she and the Duke lifted the loose floorboard. Inside rested a weatherproof tin box wrapped carefully in oilcloth. With trembling hands Eleanor opened it. The first bundle contained the genuine land deeds bearing authentic signatures. The second revealed forged contracts proving Victor's fraud. Beneath them lay a leather notebook listing every bribe paid to judges, clerks, and officials. Finally, folded inside a faded envelope, rested Thomas's final letter. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as she recognized his handwriting. He had written the letter shortly before leaving to expose Victor's crimes, explaining where the evidence remained hidden if anything happened to him. He begged her never to surrender hope because truth possessed remarkable patience. The Duke quietly looked away, allowing her private grief the dignity of silence. A sharp smell interrupted the moment. Smoke. One servant burst through the doorway. Your Grace, the roof. Flames climbed the outer walls with terrifying speed. Someone had poured lamp oil around the cottage before setting it ablaze. Victor had realized the evidence still existed. He had come to destroy it forever. The Duke thrust the box into the servant's arms. Take this outside. Everyone hurried toward the door as burning beams groaned overhead. Snow hissed into steam wherever sparks landed. Eleanor clutched Thomas's letter against her heart while choking smoke filled every room. They escaped into the freezing air just as part of the roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash. Then Eleanor screamed. One of the triplets was missing. During the frantic search inside the cottage, curious little James had wandered from the waiting wagon chasing a carved wooden toy dropped near the doorway. Before anyone noticed, he had toddled back inside through the smoke. Tiny cries now echoed faintly behind collapsing walls. The servants rushed forward, but blazing timbers blocked the entrance. The Duke did not hesitate. Ignoring desperate shouts behind him, he wrapped a heavy wool blanket around his shoulders and charged through the flames. Inside, fire devoured everything. Smoke blinded him. Burning rafters crashed beside his boots. He called James's name again and again until a frightened cry answered from beneath a fallen table. The child lay trapped behind splintered beams too heavy for tiny hands to move. The Duke hurled the burning wood aside despite searing heat ripping through his sleeves. He lifted the sobbing boy against his chest and turned toward the doorway. At that instant a blazing beam crashed across his back. Pain exploded through his body. Still he refused to fall. Shielding James beneath the blanket, he staggered forward one determined step after another until strong hands pulled them both into the snow. The cottage collapsed completely behind them. Doctors fought through the night to treat the Duke's burns. His back, shoulders, and arms bore angry wounds, yet James escaped with nothing worse than smoke-blackened cheeks and frightened tears. Eleanor scarcely left the bedside where the Duke lay unconscious. She cooled his fever, changed fresh bandages, and read Thomas's final letter only once before placing it safely beside the recovered evidence. Watching the man who had risked everything for her child, she felt gratitude quietly become something deeper, warmer, and infinitely more frightening. Several days later the Duke finally opened his eyes. Eleanor tried smiling through exhausted tears. "I don't know how to repay what you've done." He reached carefully for her hand despite the pain. "You owe me nothing." "I loved my husband," she whispered. "Part of me fears loving anyone again dishonors him." The Duke's weary expression softened. "Loving again doesn't erase the love you lost," he said gently. "It simply proves your heart survived." Unable to answer, Eleanor pressed his hand against her cheek as silent tears spoke the words neither of them were ready to confess. Outside the chamber window, church bells suddenly rang across the valley, announcing that constables had ridden into Victor Blackwood's estate carrying warrants, recovered evidence, and Thomas's final letter, while the frightened banker stared toward the snowy horizon realizing the fire meant to bury the truth had instead illuminated every crime he had ever committed. Snow still blanketed the countryside when Victor Blackwood was dragged from his grand estate in iron shackles before the very townspeople he had spent years intimidating. The recovered land deeds, forged contracts, bribery ledger, and Thomas's final letter were read aloud in the courthouse square, each document stripping away another layer of the banker's carefully crafted respectability. Witnesses who had once remained silent finally found courage after seeing undeniable proof. Officials confessed to accepting bribes. Former servants revealed hidden meetings with hired thugs. By sunset, every lie Victor had built his fortune upon had collapsed beneath the weight of truth. As constables led him toward the prison carriage, he searched desperately for someone willing to defend him. No one moved. The crowd that had once feared him now turned away in quiet disgust. Eleanor stood beside the Duke without triumph in her eyes. Justice brought relief, but it could never return her father or Thomas. She quietly folded Thomas's final letter and placed it inside the pocket over her heart. The Duke noticed the gesture yet offered no interruption. He understood that love remembered was never a rival to love newly found. Instead, it became part of the path that led a wounded soul toward healing. Several weeks later the court officially restored every acre of the Whitford property to Eleanor. Lawyers congratulated her on reclaiming one of the finest estates in the county, expecting she would immediately rebuild the family home and secure a prosperous future for herself and the triplets. Instead, she surprised everyone by requesting a meeting with the Duke, the village elders, and the local physician who had once apprenticed under her father. She unfolded a hand-drawn map across the library table. "This land has already cost too many lives," she said softly. "I don't want it remembered only for greed." The Duke studied her thoughtful expression. "What do you want it remembered for?" She smiled with quiet certainty. "For mercy." Her plans transformed the estate into something no one expected. The old Whitford house became a shelter where widows with children could find warmth, honest work, and safety without paying a single coin. The abandoned clinic reopened beneath her father's name, offering treatment to rich and poor alike. Empty barns became workshops where women learned sewing, weaving, and other trades that allowed them to earn independent livelihoods. Beside the railway station, where despair had nearly claimed 4 innocent lives, construction began on a modest hospice with hot meals, clean beds, and open doors for stranded travelers caught by storms. Eleanor insisted that every lantern remain lit throughout winter nights. "No mother," she often repeated, "should ever wonder whether kindness has disappeared from the world." The Duke watched her work with growing admiration. She greeted laborers by name, carried supplies despite protests from servants, and spent long afternoons rocking frightened children whose mothers had sought refuge at the shelter. The triplets toddled happily behind her wherever she went, laughing as though sorrow had never existed. Their joy spread through every room they entered. The once silent Duke laughed more freely than anyone had believed possible, lifting all 3 children onto his shoulders until their delighted squeals echoed across the grounds. One snowy afternoon the youngest tugged insistently upon the Duke's coat. He knelt with a curious smile. "What is it, little one?" Tiny fingers pointed toward Eleanor across the courtyard before wrapping around the Duke's hand. "Mama," the child chirped proudly. Then he pressed the Duke's hand against his own small chest. "Papa." Silence settled gently between the adults. Eleanor's eyes shimmered with unexpected tears. The Duke swallowed hard, realizing the children had already given him a place no title could ever equal. That evening he walked alone through the estate gardens, reflecting upon every moment since stepping onto that frozen station platform months earlier. He had believed himself a man emptied by grief, destined merely to endure the remaining years of his life. Instead, 3 children had filled his empty halls with laughter, while one courageous woman had restored warmth to every forgotten corner of his heart. Love had arrived not with grand declarations but through bedtime stories, repaired cradles, shared burdens, and countless quiet acts of compassion. When the first heavy snowfall of the season returned, the Duke requested that Eleanor accompany him into town without explaining why. Their carriage stopped beside the lonely railway platform where they had first met. The old wooden bench remained beneath fresh snow exactly where she had nearly surrendered her life. Workers had recently polished the brass plaque fastened across its back, though Eleanor had not yet seen it. She stepped closer and read the engraved words. On this bench, despair ended, and a family began. Emotion overwhelmed her. Before she could speak, the Duke quietly removed one glove and lowered himself onto one knee in the snow. Passengers waiting for the afternoon train fell completely silent. Railway workers stopped lifting luggage. Even the station master removed his cap. The Duke looked into Eleanor's eyes with unwavering tenderness. "The night I found you here, I believed I was rescuing 4 strangers." His voice caught briefly before continuing. "I know now that you were rescuing me." He reached into his coat and revealed a simple gold ring. "You taught this house to smile again. You taught 3 children to trust. You taught a grieving man that hope can survive impossible winters." He drew one careful breath. "Eleanor Whitford, will you honor me by becoming my wife, not because you need saving, but because I cannot imagine another day without you beside me?" Tears slipped freely down her cheeks. She glanced toward the triplets standing with Mrs. Ashcombe. All 3 clapped excitedly, though they scarcely understood the moment unfolding before them. Eleanor returned her gaze to the man who had carried her from death, protected her dignity, risked his life for her child, and loved her without demanding she forget the past. "Yes," she whispered. Then, with joyful certainty stronger than any storm she had ever survived, she repeated, "Yes." Cheers erupted across the station. The station master rang the departure bell with unusual enthusiasm while strangers applauded as though celebrating their own family. Their wedding took place several weeks later beneath gently falling snow inside the village church where Eleanor had once secretly married Thomas. Before the ceremony began, she visited his grave alone, placing fresh white roses upon the stone. "Thank you," she whispered. "Your courage brought me here." She left not with guilt, but with peace. The church overflowed with people whose lives had been touched by the couple's kindness. Widows from the shelter filled the front pews beside railway workers, physicians, servants, gardeners, and villagers. The retired nurse who had delivered the triplets aboard the train wiped joyful tears as she watched them toddle down the aisle wearing tiny winter coats and carrying little white flowers almost larger than their hands. Laughter rippled through the congregation when the smallest paused halfway to hug the Duke's leg before continuing proudly toward the altar. During the ceremony, the Duke made one final promise beyond the wedding vows. Before every witness present, he signed the legal papers adopting all 3 children as his own. "I may not have given you life," he said while lifting each child into his arms, "but I will spend the rest of mine protecting yours." Years passed, and every winter the hospice welcomed frightened travelers with warm fires, fresh bread, and open hearts. One blizzard evening another young mother arrived at the same station carrying a shivering infant, uncertain where to turn. Before she reached the old bench, a familiar carriage stopped beside the platform. Eleanor, now the Duchess, stepped down first, wrapped the woman in a thick wool cloak, and smiled with the same gentle compassion that had once saved her own life. "No mother spends the night here anymore," she said. "Come home with us." The Duke lifted the baby with practiced tenderness while their 3 laughing children gathered blankets and baskets of food. Together they climbed into the waiting carriage as snow drifted softly around them. The station slowly disappeared behind swirling white, but the light shining from the carriage windows remained visible far down the tracks, carrying hope into the winter darkness and proving that one act of mercy had become a legacy that would warm countless hearts for generations to come.